Gloria in excelsis Deo.
When Catholics dialogue with Protestants, they sometimes fall into the habit of trying to make difficult Catholic claims as small as possible so they can be swallowed more easily and cause less scandal to the Protestant. Papal infallibility is where this problem comes up most often, with well-meaning Catholics preaching error but believing that they are simply giving a minimal version of Catholicism. In particular, the claim is often made that there have been only 2 instances of papal infallibility in history, namely the 1854 dogma of the Immaculate Conception and the 1950 dogma of the Assumption of Mary. It is the aim of this video to show beyond a reasonable doubt that this claim is needlessly conservative to the point of error, and to demonstrate other instances of papal infallibility. Let's first explain what we mean by papal infallibility in general. When God gave the Israelites their scriptures, laws, and traditions, He did not leave them orphans who would be expected to follow God's commands without guidance and assistance. Rather, God left them Moses to interpret and judge contentious cases through an ongoing magisterium which exercises divine authority. In the new covenant of Christ, God likewise gives us an ongoing magisterium to interpret and definitively explain what is either explicitly or implicitly held in the oral and written tradition of the Church, through the function of the office of Peter, who, like Moses, sits from a seat of divine authority to judge the people of God. This power was expressly defined at the First Vatican Ecumenical Council in 1870, which says that the Pope has the power of speaking from the chair of Peter, ex cathedra, in which capacity he is infallible, for, when he speaks ex cathedra, that is, when acting in the office of shepherd and teacher of all Christians, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals. Such definitions of the Roman Pontiff are therefore irreformable of themselves, not because of the consent of the Church. Like all teachings of ecumenical councils, this definition on papal infallibility is not intended to be understood as a new teaching, but rather a solemn declaration on what was already contained in the tradition, and simply required greater clarity in the face of opposition to that tradition. As Bishop Vincent Gasser, the most prominent theologian of the First Vatican Council, said in the official relatio released in conjunction with the Council, thousands and thousands of dogmatic judgments have already gone forth from the Apostolic See. Bishop Gasser may be padding this number a bit for reasons we shall get into momentarily, but if the intention of the First Vatican Council is to declare that the Pope currently has, and has always had, this specific power of ex cathedra definitions, then who would defend the view that the popes only just started using this power 200 years ago, and what's their justification for this view? There are not many theologians who will seriously defend the idea that there are only 2 instances of ex cathedra declarations, at least among those who simultaneously accept the declaration of the First Vatican Council. There is an article for a publication called U.S. Catholic, written by Kevin Considine, in which he asserts the 2 infallible statements hypothesis. However, his article is very short and doesn't provide any reasons for his claim. There's also a non-academic book written by 2 priests citing the double infallibility hypothesis, and of course there are many anecdotal cases where people will seriously advance this claim, like this commenter under my meme page. None of these resources make good theological cases for what I'll continue to call the hyperminimalist claim, and more importantly, they don't provide us with the needed context to know how this topic has historically been understood. Prior to the Second World War, there was an overwhelming consensus that 1854's Ineffabilis Deus was not the only case of papal infallibility, and that it was joined by several other ex cathedra declarations. This consensus is admitted even by overly cautious papal scholars, such as German Jesuit theologian Father Klaus Schatz. In Father Klaus's Which Past Papal Doctrines Are Ex Cathedra, he discusses the pre-World War II consensus that there were a great number of infallible statements, and articulates how it was abandoned after the 1950s. But Father Kloess gives virtually no theological justification for why we should accept this departure from the tradition. Rather, he simply states, using German psychobabble, that old ideas of hierocraticism, a word referring to the supreme authority of the Pope, have fallen out of fashion, and hypothesizing a version of reception theory, not as the cause of infallibility, but the evidence for it. Yet as Father Kloess admits earlier in his own article, there was previously a theological consensus on several ex cathedra statements. Therefore, even if we were to apply Kloess's principle of theological reception, since something cannot cease to be infallible once it is made so, what was held as true then must still be true now. Father Kloess concludes by taking a backhanded swing at ex cathedra statements in general, referring to them as a deficient form of infallible definition, and fundamentally bad at resolving controversies. However, even Father Kloess is willing to reluctantly endorse an ex cathedra list bigger than 2, cautiously suggesting 7 infallible definitions. The closest thing to a semi-official church resource defending something like the hyperminimalist view is a 40-year-old joint Lutheran and Roman Catholic dialogue statement by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, which also points to the 1854 dogma of the Immaculate Conception and the 1950 dogma of the Assumption of Mary as the only uncontested examples of papal infallibility. Among the names of the editors of this text are included a number of Catholic priests, as well as a bishop named Thomas Murphy and a cardinal called Avery Dulles. This Lutheran Catholic interreligious document is pretty clearly geared towards this exact problem that we're talking about, which is making the papal claim as small as possible in an effort to encourage conversion. On page 129, it preaches a kind of agnosticism about infallibility, noting, "The exercise of infallibility is open to historical investigation, and points of doctrine that have been said to be infallibly proclaimed may in fact not have been so proclaimed." On page 148, the document simultaneously asserts that only the 1854 and 1950 declarations are generally acknowledged as being infallible, and then in the very same paragraph, as well as the subsequent one, they admit that many theologians would disagree with the USCCB Commission. In and of itself, trying to make a teaching palatable is not vicious. It can even be virtuous, as when St. Paul says that the Corinthians are not ready for solid food, or as when St. Paul says that we should become all things to all people in order to save at least some. But we still have to be careful about making bad arguments on purpose, using standards we shouldn't accept ourselves, in order to convert others. And even this document, geared towards Lutherans and at the height of the ecumenism of the 70s, does not claim that the 1854 and 1950 dogmas are necessarily the only instances of papal infallibility, and it refers to several others by the maxim, doubtfully infallible. The over-ecumenism of this document notwithstanding, it does point to something real, namely the reality that there is no official list of ex cathedra definitions, which I think helps contribute to this collective anxiety that causes theologians to avoid talking about other cases of papal infallibility. But this attitude is not consistent with the actual fathers of the First Vatican Council, who clearly understood papal infallibility as something that has happened more than just a couple times. If we look at the 2 undisputed cases of papal infallibility, 1854's Ineffabilis Deus and 1950's Munificentissimus Deus, both of these documents utilize very strong language when making their point, and they expressly reference the Petrine power as the reason why their dogmatic definition is legitimate. They also include negative clauses condemning those who do not follow their definitions as placing themselves outside the church, which is very similar to the language used in an anathema, like we would find in the infallible definitions of most ecumenical councils. So if we were to steelman the minimalist case, we might say that ex cathedra statements include clear language about the intention to bind, with the power of the office of Peter, as well as a statement clearly indicating that refusal to submit places one outside the church. The problem is that this framing is not actually asserted by the First Vatican Council itself, where it's sufficient that the Pope merely indicate that his teaching binds all the faithful in an irreformable way, and using his power as the successor of the fisherman, making no mention of specific formula or the need to clearly state that disobedience places one outside the church. After all, the negative warning is already the logical consequence of disobedience, irrespective of an explicit warning about it. John Joy, in his 2022 book on the topic of infallibility, points to the continuity between Bishop Gasser's official relatio and the parameters for infallibility presented in Vatican II's Lumen Gentium, which are subject, object, and act. Bishop Gasser's relatio notes, "The infallibility of the Roman pontiff is restricted by reason of the subject, that is, when the Pope, constituted in the chair of Peter, the center of the Church, speaks as universal teacher and supreme judge. It is restricted by reason of the object, i.e., when treating of matters of faith and morals, and by reason of the act itself, when the Pope defines what must be believed or rejected by all the faithful." And as Joy points out, very similar language, which corresponds to these 3 parameters, is found in Article 25 of Lumen Gentium about papal infallibility. As long as the parameters of subject, object, and act are met, there's no need to add additional parameters of specific language or particular formula for a declaration to be truly ex cathedra. All that is required is that the Pope clearly express something as perpetually binding, and promulgate it as the successor of Peter. It is not the purpose of this video to exhaustively list every time the Pope has infallibly used the Petrine office, talking not as a private theologian, which he may also do, but as the vicar of Christ. Nor is it to assert that the Pope is constantly speaking infallibly. As Pope John Paul II noted in a 1993 general audience, there are popes who have gone their entire papacy without ever utilizing this function. But what must be avoided is sticking our head in the sand and pretending that the popes have never bound all the faithful to some proposition using their full Petrine office, and that discovering other instances of Ex Cathedra Statements is simply impossible. Firstly, we should set aside the issue of canonizations. The aforementioned 1979 document from the USCCB reluctantly admits that prior generations of theological manuals, including St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa, rather commonly regarded the formal canonization of a saint to be an infallible act, and I hypothesize that it may have been these canonizations which caused Bishop Gasser to suggest that there were thousands of examples of papal infallibility. But padding this video with the canonizations of saints would not be very interesting, so let's tackle something more specific. Although I am in agreement with Bishop Gasser that there have been many cases of papal infallibility, for this video, let us limit ourselves to just 5, not counting Ineffabilis Deus and Munificentissimus Deus. I don't do this because this list is in any way exhaustive, but because no reasonable person can argue it, given that it is broadly supported by the historical consensus of the Church until modern times. It is supported by detractors like Kloess, and it is supported by eminent scholars from the Christian tradition, such as Father Edmund de Blanchi, a respected Marist theologian, or Cardinal Louis Belot, a ghostwriter for Pope St. Pius X. Both of these latter two theologians would certainly list additional ex cathedra entries to the ones we're about to cover, but their witness on other ex cathedra pronouncements can be a story for another time. 449's The Tome of Leo the Great is an infallible letter written by Pope Leo the Great to Bishop Flavian of Constantinople, in which Leo definitively clarified the nature of Christ against the errors of the heretic Eutyches, namely that Jesus Christ had 2 natures, human and divine, rather than 1 nature. The Tome of Leo is a key work in the history of the Christian tradition, which was understood as being an infallible exercise of the magisterium. Leo's tome, and its definitive treatment of Christ's nature, also served, by its own authority, to contradict the power of the so-called Council of Second Ephesus, whereby the Petrine power of Leo contributed to delegitimizing a council so that it could not be considered ecumenical. In recognition of the definitive way in which the Pope had acted, when the letter was read aloud 2 years later at the Council of Chalcedon, the bishops are recorded as expressing, "This is the faith of the fathers, this is the faith of the apostles, so we all believe, thus the orthodox believe, anathema to him who does not thus believe. Peter has spoken thus through Leo." A far less famous example of papal infallibility is the 680 letter of Pope Agatho to Emperor Constantine IV. Now, firstly, in the interest of complete transparency, Pope Agatho's letter is not explicitly mentioned as ex cathedra by Cardinal Belot. However, he seems to be referring to it implicitly, and I feel fully comfortable saying that he was by no means intending to deny it the full rank of infallibility. Additionally, both Father Edmund de Blanchi and Father Kloess do make explicit inclusion of this letter, and Father Kloess even mentions its inclusion in a short list of ex cathedra statements by the Fathers of the First Vatican Council. Pope Agatho's letter was written in the context of the monothelite controversy over the wills of Christ, namely whether Christ had 2 wills, 1 human, 1 divine, or the monothelite position of giving Christ a single will, which would have the consequence of denying the full humanity of the incarnate Son of God. In the face of this controversy, Pope Agatho presents a clear and exhaustive explanation of the faith directed to the emperor. As with Leo, Pope Agatho's letter definitively answered the question in favor of the full humanity and full divinity of Christ. At the Third Council of Constantinople that same year, Patriarch George of Constantinople asked that the Pope's letter be read aloud during the Council's 4th session, where it included an introduction stating, "The high, magnificent, yet true expressions which St. Agatho had used of his see, namely, that resting on the promise of the Lord, it had never turned aside from the path of truth, and that its pontiffs, the predecessors of Agatho, who were charged in the person of Peter to strengthen their brethren, had ever discharged their office. This the fathers of the council hear and receive." This preamble is notable because immediately after praising the office of Peter as having divine protection from error, this introduction follows with a condemnation of certain false positions defending monothelitism, held by Pope Honorius, who had reigned earlier in the 600s, therefore showing the clear distinction between the kind of infallible definition offered by Agatho as the successor of Peter, versus the erroneous position held by Honorius when not acting in that capacity. And you can see clearly that Pope Agatho recognized his office in the text of the letter itself, wherein amidst his many references he frequently refers back to the office of Peter as the safeguard against error, for This is the rule of the true faith. The Apostolic Church of Christ, by the grace of Almighty God, has never erred from the path of the apostolic tradition, and remains undefiled unto the end, according to the divine promise of the Lord and Savior himself, saying, Peter, Peter, behold, Satan has desired to have you, that he might sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith fail not, and when you are converted, strengthen your brethren. Jumping ahead to the later Middle Ages, 1334's Benedictus Deus by Pope Benedict XII is another interesting case of one pope infallibly correcting the fallible teaching of a previous pope. Benedictus Deus is much shorter than the 9,000+ word essay Pope Agatho gave us, and briefly serves to infallibly answer a question that had become a live issue during the reign of Benedict's immediate predecessor, John XXII. During John XXII's pontificate, the late pope had given sermons defending the idea that the saints were not presently enjoying the full beatific vision of heaven, but rather that they were being forced to wait for the general resurrection at the end of time. In refuting this error, Benedict very clearly expresses his intention to bind the faithful for all time by stating, by this constitution, which is to remain in force forever, we with apostolic authority define the following, and going on to clearly state that the saints are currently enjoying their rest in Christ's heavenly kingdom. Benedict furthermore reaffirmed the inverse position, that those who die in mortal sin go immediately to hell, without needing to wait for the end of history. The infallible character of both this correction by Pope Benedict and that of Pope Agatho are clearly very fitting, because they help diminish the scandal caused by a pope teaching error through the exercise of the infallible power of the full Petrine office. For even when the pope is not speaking infallibly, confusion inevitably arises where harmony is absent between the teaching of one pontiff and another. The heresy of Jansenism, named for followers of Belgian Bishop Cornelius Jansen, was an intransigent heretical sect of the 1600s, which held that the Counter-Reformation movement against Luther and the Reformers had overemphasized human freedom to the point of falling into the heresy of Pelagianism. Jansenism was very popular and became very difficult to stamp out. Every time the popes would condemn some aspect of Jansenism, the movement would sprout back up again and claim that their true position had not been legitimately condemned, either due to trickery or lack of specificity. In 1653, Pope Innocent X summarized and then expressly condemned 5 errors from Bishop Jansen's principal work, the Augustinus, in his constitution Cum Occasione. To frame the condemnation of these 5 propositions affirmatively, the essence of Cum Occasione is that man has genuine agency in relation to the actions of his Creator, that God gives those who earnestly seek him the grace to live well, and that God truly died for all mankind whatsoever, none of which is Pelagian or semi-Pelagian. This express condemnation was of course ignored by the Jansenists, who tried to dodge the critique by claiming that the Pope was attacking a straw man, leading to subsequent condemnations making the position more explicit. Yet the original document remained in force and was an infallible witness against Protestant theories of grace creeping into the Church. In the 1700s, Pius VI dealt with a host of errors centered around Leopold II, Duke of Tuscany, who pulled a Henry VIII and tried to make himself locally independent from Rome, with local clerics ratifying his movement at the Synod of Pistoia in 1786. Not content merely to break away from Rome's authority, the Synod of Pistoia endorsed a whole cavalcade of errors, inspired by Jansenist and Gallican ideas, including the rejection of the supreme headship of the Pope, maximizing the local jurisdictional authority of the bishops, giving civil rulers the power to deal with annulment cases, and many other issues. Given the scale of the break that was the Synod of Pistoia, 1794's Auctorum Fidei by Pope Pius VI is a very long document which contains 85 articles critiquing the complete mess that was the Synod. Due to the length of Auctorum Fidei and the different phrasing found between these 85 comments, there is not universal agreement about whether every single condemnation is infallible, or only those framed most strongly. For although all 85 condemnations may be true, they might not all be ex cathedra. Father Kloess parses this list down to 7, as only 7 of these censures are explicitly listed as heretical, while others contain less explicit language such as false, rash, and erroneous, or fostering schism and heresy. Some commentators, like Cardinal John Franzlin in his Tractatus de Divina Traditione et Scriptura, or Father Lucien Chopin in Valor des Décisions Doctrinales et Disciplinaires du Saint-Siège, consider these lesser condemnations to still be under the banner of ex cathedra, but this is a video about establishing a baseline level of absolute safety, so for our purposes today, as well as for the sake of time, Let's take the minimalist position established by Kloess, which leaves us with propositions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 15, and 85, which are principally concerned with the Synod of Pistoia's distorted understanding of the nature of Christ. To approximate their contents, the first proposition condemns the idea that Christ's more important teachings have become generally obscured. The second, that priests derive their authority from the flock they serve. The third, that the Petrine office lacks universal jurisdiction. The fourth, that the Church cannot censure exterior discipline and should limit itself to doctrine and morals. Fifth, that the Church cannot coerce with force and must make do only with verbal or written persuasion. 15th, that the faithful belong to the Church in the same sense as the clerics. And 85th, that a national council can function as an ecumenical council. This concludes our 5 Ex Cathedra Statements. I hope I have adequately explained the essentials of these doctrines, that you found this exploration informative, and that I have provided you with resources to contradict the idea that there are only 2 Ex Cathedra Statements.